Hello. The title of this short presentation is Consumer Voting Behavior Regarding Swine Gestation, Crates or Stalls. As noted in several other short presentations, the U.S. consuming public and voting public is expressing increasing concern with how farm animals being raised for meat, milk, and egg production are handled and cared for. I'm going to refer to that general concern as animal welfare concerns for the purpose of this presentation. One of the particular practices that's been talked about in those discussions and been the focus of concern is the use by the U.S. swine industry of gestation crates or stalls. Gestation crates or stalls are used throughout the industry to house individually female breeding stock, that's sows or gilts, when they are not at the lactating stage, or that is before they give birth to their offspring and start nursing their offspring. The point for this discussion is that particular practice has been banned now as of May 2010 in 7 different states, or there's been either ballot initiatives passed or state legislation has been passed that either bans it as of today or bans it for some period, some time period into the future. This raises lots of economic concerns, some of which have been highlighted in other presentations, but the key one for today is to note there's very little understanding about what drives voting behavior on things such as ballot initiatives, where an issue such as gestation crates or stall use is being discussed. This in turn presents a lot of dilemmas for the industry and how they respond to these concerns. It's not as simple as just responding and disadopting a practice. You don't know exactly what practice to use, and ultimately I would argue that if you don't have good insights about what the resident public who's voting is concerned about, you can't make ideal adjustments. So the objectives of this study that's being highlighted in this short presentation was to assess the drivers of resident support for ballot initiatives, narrowly looking at the issue of banning use of gestation crates or stalls to try to gain insights into this issue. As noted in other discussions, I've conducted multiple consumer surveys. The primary collaborator in that work is Chris Wolf at Michigan State University, and the data I'm going to use in the paper I'm highlighting today also comes from one of those surveys. Okay. In particular, what I want to highlight in this presentation is the responses and drivers to responses on the following question. Now, I'm not going to read this entire question to you, just the verbiage here looks just like it did in our survey, and in short, it's a repeat of the verbiage that showed up in Florida and Arizona's ballot initiatives that discussed whether or not gestation crates and stalls should be banned from use by pork producers in those respective states. Responses in our survey to this question, omitting some key states that were further along in these discussions to keep from biasing the results, were 69% revealed they would support a similar ban in their state. Okay, that 69% isn't far off from the 63% that actually passed Proposition 2. The deeper question is, okay, let's go further. Let's try to understand what's driving this behavior and what is it the resident actually wants. Okay, so the first thing we did was we examined how alternative pork labeling schemes may influence support for things like this ballot initiative. In particular, we asked if pork products in the U.S. contained more information about whether or not gestation crates or stalls were being used, okay, would this impact support? In particular, 18% of those that initially indicated they would support a ban or ballot initiative that had a ban involved would change their vote to against if the pork industry had pork products that were labeled indicating whether or not that pork product, or that pork chop, if you like, comes from a farm that uses gestation crates or stalls. And basically the take-home point there is it's a signal that some or a portion of those that are voting for a ban could be appeased by additional transparency, if you like. Now, transparency is not free, and additional labeling is not free, but that could appease some of the concerns of some of the resident voters that are showing up to vote on these issues. Secondly, we went further and we said not only if there was more labeling indicating use of crates or stalls, but also if there was an additional food safety inspection. We asked this to figure out if there's a tie, a food safety inference, with the use of gestation crates or stalls. And what we found was instead of 18% switching their vote, 23% would switch if there was an additional labeling to indicate whether crates or stalls were used, as well as additional food safety procedures. That again reduces your total for amount, but the important take-home point is there's a notable portion of the public that is supporting these bans that is making a food safety tie with the use of gestation crates or stalls. Obviously, an important question to ask is, what is the public thinking the price impacts of these kind of ballot initiatives may be? And the summary statement from this slide is a good chunk of the public just doesn't know. Okay? In particular, when you look at the whole set of 1,000 respondents, 42% indicated they do not know what the price impacts of this ban would be. Of that portion that indicates that they know, or of that 58% that gave us a response on a particular impact, 64% are suggesting that prices may go up by 6% or more. So the take-home point there, even before you look at how people vote, is a good chunk, 42%, don't know what the price impact would be, or they're not even willing to guess on it, so they're quite unsure. But of those that think they know, there's notable evidence that they expect a price increase, which is intuitive. Okay? When you break this down between those that voted for versus those that voted against the ban in our question, you'll notice the carryover on the don't knows is fairly similar in both groups, but there's a notable difference among those that indicated they know a price impact. As noted, another key thing we wanted to examine was what are the actual determinants of voting for or against ban questions, such as we're talking about here. Observable demographics are generally not a driver of responses. That is, gender, education, income, so forth, as a group, are rarely good predictors of whether somebody's going to be vote for or against these ban questions. Moreover, the state of residence, or measured differently, the pork industry prevalence, as a percentage of GDP or its national rank in the U.S., are not main drivers of somebody voting for or against these ballot initiative questions. Rather, the key thing we find is what I call latent perceptions, or the perceptions that individuals hold between the use of gestation crates or stalls and food safety risk, pork quality, farm size, and ownership style, legal ownership, are more likely to drive whether somebody votes for or against these ballot initiatives. And those different associations are unobservable, which makes it difficult in the industry to respond, because you can't just look at the public and say, oh, you're somebody that makes these associations and you're somebody that doesn't. So that's a challenge. But nonetheless, it's important to recognize because these associations are driving voting behavior, and quite potentially when it comes to target marketing of your message, whether this industry that's trying to get a against vote or the other side of the coin, the supporters of these bans, either one that's trying to push a message, it's going to be hard to target individuals when these latent perceptions are really what's driving voting behavior. So that presents a unique dilemma. How sensitive is resident support to the actual time the producers have to implement these adjustments? Okay, it's pretty common. For instance, Proposition 2 that passed in California, there's about a 6-year adjustment window, passed in November 2008, and producers have until January 2015 to come into compliance before there's legal ramifications. So 6 to 8 years is the common time period, but nobody's really aware of how sensitive support for ballot initiatives is to that time period. So we assessed that, and what we found was residents are generally insensitive to this. Or stated differently, they're equally supportive of a ban that requires 2-year adjustment windows versus something that gives producers 12 years. They vote the same, or statistically speaking, there's the same portion of support in those two different schemes. This has notable implications for pork industry and policymakers, I'd argue. The first one is the entity that is most heard, or arguably the first one at the table for a resident voter to hear, has a unique opportunity to set the adjustment table. The fact that residents are insensitive to what that is means the first voice can probably change that to meet their goals. Secondly, there's, corresponding to that point, is there substantial cost of not being active or sending a mixed signal that doesn't make your point clear. And finally, the industry, this suggests the swine industry might have an opportunity to pursue longer implementation tables. Now, some in the industry don't want to think of it this way, but I think it's important that there's 2 stages of evaluation. The first is whether or not you think a ballot initiative is going to pass. And then secondly, if it does pass, how do we respond? Well, this point becomes particularly important on the second stage. It is conditional on a ban going into place, whether it's nationally or individual states. The key part of the economic welfare impacts on producers is how much time do you have to adjust? That is, to figure out what the consumer actually wants. It's one thing to say you want to ban the use of gestation crates or stalls. It's another thing to identify the specific practice to replace it. Things like facility depreciation. The longer timetable you have to adjust, the more likely you are to use the full working life of an existing building. Those kind of things are quite important to note here. So, thank you for your time. Enjoy your day.